And research shows, Rick, that, athletes, and this goes to baseball and across sport, have higher levels of PTSD, have, oftentimes higher levels of substance use, eating disorder type stuff. So, there's all kinds of issues that we know are probably due to the unique stress that sports presents, as great as it can be, right? There's also that downside. So being aware of that, recognizing it, modeling good behavior, and then providing those outlets, I think are good places to start at the very least.
That was sports psychiatrist Dr. Jimmy Moley. Hello and welcome to episode 122 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Dr. Jimmy Moley will be my guest on the show today as we talk about the way mental health impacts sports from the youth level all the way to the professional ranks. Let's get right into this very interesting conversation. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Moley.
Thank you for having me.
So we talk a lot of baseball on the podcast. We have for the past 4.5 years, but there's one aspect of the game that we haven't really addressed, and that's where you are an expert. And I thought this would be a really interesting conversation for a lot of our listeners. You deal in sports psychiatry, and you deal with the mental aspect of the game. So why don't you talk a little bit about your background and why you are an expert on this issue, and then we're going to get a little more into maybe some misconceptions that fans have about your job and what you do as a doctor.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much. So my background started at the University of Notre Dame, actually, where I received my undergraduate degree, and then I completed my medical school and residency training at The Ohio State University. So that was my background and training. I do have a certification in sports psychiatry through the International Society for Sports Psychiatry. And really, my passion for sports began, at a young age. I knew I wanted to work somewhere in the field, right? And then as the, interest in medicine and really psychiatry grew from wanting to make those personal connections and really help people, on a pretty deep level, began to understand that sports psychiatry was really an emerging field, right? And I'm sure, as we'll talk about, right, the awareness and, really just dedication to improving mental health amongst athletes has skyrocketed, right, in the past 5 to 10 years. So really looking to stake my claim in the field, and started my own private practice back in my hometown near Cleveland, Ohio, and been up and running now just over a year. And it's been really great, to interact with athletes really of all levels and understand, the culture, the challenges that they face, and hopefully make a difference in their lives.
So I was going to save this question towards the end of the conversation, but since you just mentioned it when talking about your background, you went to both Notre Dame and Ohio State. So in the college football national championship this past year, keeping in mind this is the Irish Baseball Podcast, I just want to know, who did you root for in that game?
It's not going to be a popular answer. I grew up in Ohio, born a Buckeye, but conflicting allegiance, we'll put it that way.
All right, I guess we'll let you off the hook for that one. So I wanted to talk about what you do in terms of, I think a lot of people think of a sports psychiatrist and they think of Chuck Knobloch when he got the yips and he couldn't throw the ball from second base to first base, or Rick Ankiel, the pitcher turned outfielder who just all of a sudden couldn't throw a strike. Do you find that a lot of people don't start searching out for somebody like you until they're dealing with a situation like that, when maybe they should be looking into it a whole lot earlier to avoid situations like that? And maybe those are only extreme examples of why somebody would need a sports psychiatrist, when maybe there are much more day-to-day issues that your services help with as well.
It's a really great, interesting point, and I think one that has changed historically over the years. So in the mental health field, stigma has always been, if not the number one issue, amongst the top issues, right? And I think that lends itself in the past to this idea of being very reactive. So like you said, there's an issue that comes up, Someone gets the yips. I think you gave two great examples there in Knobloch and Ankiel, right? And I think that was always the historical model. Oh my gosh, something has gone wrong. Let's call in the psychiatrist quick, right? Can you come see him right away, right? That's been the model in the past. And that's probably mostly informed by stigma and maybe a lack of understanding of what psychiatry can do. I do think, as time goes on here, we are learning more and more about the ability to be proactive with mental health concerns. And the idea that we need to put structures in place within teams, within organizations, and that starts at the youth level all the way on up to not only protect against mental health issues, but to really start using mental health as a tool, right? Just as you have a hitting coach or a pitching coach, a personal trainer, right? If there's a mental coach on board or someone with the background to be able to optimize the mental part of your game, we're learning that can be oftentimes just as important as those other more specialized trainers.
So would you say that the mental health of sports goes down to even like the youth levels, and these are things that there could be bad habits, or maybe even a bad habit isn't the right way to view it, but there might be things happening even at the youth level that start to show up in the mental health of an athlete when they make it to college or the pros or some level where all of a sudden the stress is so magnified and people are looking at the situation as if it just happened when the symptoms started to arise. But maybe a lot of these things are rooted further into the past, into the youth sports culture, and there are things that we have to do there so that we're building healthier athletes, not just with their arms, with their legs, with their knees, but also with their mental health as they deal with the increase in the stress of the game.
Without a doubt, right? That the stress seeps down to the youth sports level and really around the world and in the United States, right? Youth sports culture, has many challenges, right? To be frank, I think there's definitely more of an increasing trend, specifically in baseball, for early specialization, right? For pitching year round, playing year round, and this really almost like a professional approach from a very young age. That comes with a certain amount of stress, just kind of inherently built in, right? There's pressures from multiple players, what we call like stakeholders, right, in the life of an athlete. So not only do you have the athlete, you have the parents, the coaches, the trainers, teachers, right? Everyone who has a stake, in the future of the player. So I think we're learning about those stressors, being present from a very early age. And like you said, oftentimes when I get referrals, it's for players who have experienced injury, early retirement, a trade, free agency, right? Where there's an acute change, where all of a sudden these issues that have been maybe simmering under the surface now just completely boil over the top. So I think really looking, like you said, starting at that youth sports level and how do we create environments where, kids and athletes feel comfortable expressing their emotions, talking about the mental side of the game, having people that they trust in their life to when they do start to experience, negative feelings that they can turn to. I think those are all really important and prevent, probably those issues down the road, kind of in that same kind of idea of a preventative model.
How do we as adults, and we can talk a lot about the pro game and we can talk about the college game, but none of us are ever going to have the impact on those sports the way that we can on youth sports. So I think that's sort of one of the reasons that I wanted to focus a little bit more on youth sports, at least at the beginning of this conversation, because I feel like that's where a lot of us who are interested in baseball, might volunteer to coach a youth team or be an umpire at that level. So we have a lot of high school coaches and youth coaches who are members of the Irish American Baseball Society. So I feel like this is where we can have the biggest impact. So are there things that we can do as adults who are dealing with young kids who are playing the sport for the first time that set them up to have better success in the future? We're not looking to put you out of business. Your job is always going to be needed. But is there a way to stress the learning aspects of youth sports and maybe not focus so much on the wins and losses or the bottom lines? Would you say that would be a healthier way of going about it?
Definitely. I think it's important to remember that, young athletes growing up even into the high school years, right, are still at a very impressionable developmental age. Even from just a neurobiological standpoint, we know that, neural connections are still being formed, developed, and matured, even into those high school and early college years. What that means then is that, athletes still have a lot of room to grow. They have a lot of room to, kind of model what they see. I think so. A lot of times we see, behavior of parents, coaches, umpires, that sort of thing, right? That makes a big difference in what an athlete sees, what they understand as being acceptable, and how they, treat other people and treat themselves, right, and their teammates. I think it first starts with kind of modeling the correct behavior, right? I think it also involves making sure that athletes have avenues to express themselves in multiple different ways, right? Ways where they feel comfortable, and not just where they're going to be met with a message of, toughen up, sweep it under the rug sort of message. That's when we kind of see those problems develop down the road. I mean, research shows, Rick, that, athletes, and this goes to baseball and across sport, have higher levels of PTSD, have, oftentimes higher levels of substance use, eating disorder type stuff. So, I mean, there's all kinds of issues that we know are probably due to the unique stress that sports presents, as great as it can be, right? There's also that downside. So being aware of that, recognizing it, modeling good behavior, and then providing those outlets, I think are good places to start at the very least.
I heard you mention eating disorders, which I guess seems like on the surface wouldn't necessarily make sense because you think of athletes and maybe they have a meal plan, but you think of them as having a healthy meal plan. But I don't think a lot of people realize that, especially like getting into the high school level and a little before that, you don't have nutritionists in eighth grade football, but you might have to make weight to play eighth grade football. Or if you don't, you might, like, for example, I'm 6'4". When I was in sixth grade, I was on the eighth grade football team and I wasn't making weight every week, So you end up having these situations where you have kids in like sixth grade who are starving themselves during the week and running with trash bags around them. And I can't even imagine what it's like in wrestling, where making weight is a huge deal. Do you find that these are the ways that people end up having these eating disorders, because things like making weight and showing maybe a college recruiter that you can trim down a little bit, get to a desirable weight, add maybe a little bit of speed in addition to your strength, that these things end up staying with people because they don't have the proper nutrition until they get to maybe college or the pros?
Absolutely. And I think what we see is this idea that, more is always better, right? So more, like you said, more speed, more power, more training, right? The answer is always more. And oftentimes we don't think about, eating in terms of energy. So that's how I usually like to frame the discussion, right? So you're outputting all of this energy into your training and into your practices, everything like that you do privately. But what kind of energy are you bringing in? And how do those things balance out? Right. So, like you said, they might not be working with a nutritionist and kind of the right type of balancing the right type of fuel. And then how does that factor into everything else that you're doing? And, a lot of times I get athletes who come in and may not even be aware, right, that this is an issue. And you're like, well, let's see, you're training X amount of hours per day, but you're only bringing in so many calories. Those things are out of balance and, maybe contributing to some of these symptoms that you're having or some of these issues. So, I think, just awareness of, what that looks like. And like you said, probably a more nuanced understanding of how energy affects performance and the idea of kind of balance as part of an overall healthy picture.
An example that I sometimes use, and my father's side of the family, every one of his brothers and sisters played college sports, right? My father,
Mm-hmm.
he played Division I college football, Division I college baseball. His brothers and sisters played D2, D3. And there was a joke that the day after they played their last organized sporting event, they put on 75 pounds. Like, it was just what would happen. Do you find that there's an opposite reaction to the people who maybe starve themselves or go for that weight and didn't really put together the proper dining plan, if you will, to people who, as they start to phase out of sports, they are still living a life, they're still doing a caloric intake that is accustomed to having that, 2-hour practice, the two-a-days in August. And is it hard to, not just nutrition wise, but is it hard mentally to adjust from, I am an active athlete now and I'm phasing out of that, and I'm moving into a life where I'm not going to get this structured exercise, and I'm not going to have a team, and I'm not going to have the motivation of making grades so that I can stay eligible for the team? Are all of these factors something that, as people age out of their sports, that you find are really difficult situations?
It is really part of what makes that transition so hard, right? There is no manual for retirement, right? There is no manual when all of a sudden, maybe you need to have Tommy John surgery, right? And that takes you out for a year or something like that. And it really goes back to, we have a lot of discussions about identity in sport and what, who you are as a person. So oftentimes sports from a young age require, nearly 100% dedication, right? In terms of time, energy, effort, money, mental thought, everything, right? And that's what helps people reach the levels of success that they do. The problem with that is it doesn't leave room for any sort of really other development in a meaningful way. So when, that gets stripped for whatever reason, injury, retirement, trade, what have you, then it's like we're left picking up the pieces. So, and that kind of speaks to that thing, right? Of kind of, who are you as a person, outside of the game, or who, how can we build up maybe some of this resilience early on so that when the inevitable change happens, we're ready to deal with that. So I think that's definitely part of it. It's what makes transition so difficult. And really, there's so much support when you're playing, right? You have people you can turn to. There's whole staffs. There's people who their whole job is dedicated to your well-being. When that goes away, it's oftentimes you're kind of left looking around, being like, who's still in my corner here, right? So that's part of the challenge, absolutely, and something that we have to deal with very frequently.
I heard a story that I think fits at this moment, where there was a basketball camp, and one of the instructors at the basketball camp was Pistol Pete Maravich. And the kids were sitting around, and Pistol Pete was spinning the ball on his finger and doing a whole bunch of tricks. And after he did his little presentation, one of the kids ran up to Pistol Pete's father, who was his basketball coach in college and at different levels, and said, "How long did it take him to learn how to do that?" And his dad said, "It took him his entire life." And the kid looked him back in the eyes and said, "I don't got that kind of time." Like, we put so much emphasis. It is such a big part of your youth. If you're trying to play professional sports, if you're trying to play college sports, it has to be your number one dedication. And then, like you said, it gets to the point that maybe it stops going well. Everybody learns there's one day where everybody isn't going to do it anymore, right? Michael Jordan, even though he was good on the Wizards, knew he couldn't do it anymore. It comes for everybody, no matter how good. And that adjustment, when you've been focusing so much, I guess you say it's identity. That's the big thing that you have to say, did Pistol Pete Maravich have an identity outside of basketball? Did he train too much, and that led to some of the issues in his later life? How do you suggest your players, your clients, get that balance where they do have an identity that maybe is separated from their sport?
It's a good question. I think the challenge is to really understand what makes them tick and utilize their strengths in other areas besides sport, right? So I think, when you become maybe a high level collegiate pro pitcher, right, that there's qualities about you that probably led to that development. And it's like, well, what do we understand about those qualities? How can we use those and maybe to funnel into different interests, to passions, to who you are as a brother, a sister, a cousin, right? A friend. And like, how do we kind of develop you and work within that framework? I think you run into trouble when it's like, you maybe drop into a situation and be like, well, let's try this other interest, right? Or something kind of out of left field. I think it has to make sense to the athlete. It has to be something that feels organic and really kind of discover almost like unlived parts of themselves, right? And kind of let those flourish. So I think it's really an individualized question, right? But one that I think tries to utilize those strengths in a way that makes sense and is translatable to post athletic life.
I think when I look back at myself as an athlete when I was younger, and you would not pick up hobbies because you knew that they would take away from sports. I remember, they were looking for people to play musical instruments. And now as an adult, and I play a little guitar, but it took me a long time to learn it. Like, that's not an easy thing to pick up when you're in your 30s as opposed to when you're in your teens. And is there a problem that a lot of athletes have? And I'm sure this is not just focused on athletes. I'm sure this is a lot of people across the board, where they're so focused on this one goal that they don't even understand that you can have hobbies, that there can be things that you don't have to give 100% effort. You can just, you know, paint, or you can play an instrument, and it doesn't have to turn into your life. You don't have to practice it 4 hours a day. There are things that you can do that are just for enjoyment. Is that something that you have to sometimes teach athletes?
It is that does come up pretty frequently, I would say, and we usually talk about too. There are multiple benefits of having diverse interests and different skill sets. You know that goes to sports and that goes to life. There's a book by David Epstein called Range where they talk about the idea that like Roger Federer growing up played 10 different sports and how that really he uses those skills that he learned in other sports in terms of body movements and kinetics and the mental side to really help him become one of the best tennis players of all time. So in kind of like on a smaller scale, right, a football player who paints, right, there's probably certain dexterity involved in that, right? There's certain artistic creativity. So I think a lot of work is like demonstrating, hey, that these other things have value. Your goals are still aligned. We can still do things that allow you to become the most well-rounded, strongest, most interesting possible person you can be. But that can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't always have to fit that traditional mold.
And we're not diagnosing any of these athletes that I mentioned, whether it be Knobloch or Pistol Pete or whatever. But I know with Michael Jordan, one of the things was he was competitive with everything. It was golf, and he had to, put $5,000 on the golf game because he had to, or he didn't even have to put 5,000. If he put $5 on the golf game, that was enough to make him competitive and have to win it. And is there a way to separate parts of your life where you can say, okay, in sports, I have to be hyper competitive, but in other aspects of my life, in my marriage, in my relationships with other people, in playing guitar, in my hobbies, I don't have to bring that same type of intensity, that same type of competitiveness, and you can see a balance in the people's lives?
Definitely something to discuss, right? And it's very tricky because there's a fine line, right? We want people to express their personalities, to be competitive, right? That's what drives people. It's what allows people to be fulfilled. But like you said, there is probably a line at some point, right, where you cross, and this is where we maybe see post-retirement issues with like substance use and things where you're like searching for that drive that just doesn't exist, like you said, in a boardroom or in a classroom, right? So I think kind of learning to set appropriate expectations, channel that, whatever it is, that competitive drive, that competitive spirit, and then kind of apply it in the right areas. And oftentimes athletes are not, and this goes to everybody in the population, right? We're not equipped to understand maybe necessarily how to strike that balance all the time. So that's where it helps to have people to be able to talk to, right? And balance things out. So I think kind of walking, like I said, that delicate line between encouraging competitiveness, competitive spirit, but also realizing, hey, well, what's appropriate behavior and how do we optimize this without making it a problem?
Now, I'm a big analytics guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love the numbers. And I would swear that there's no such thing as a player who is clutch.
Mm-hmm.
Now, would you, as somebody who looks at this from the psychiatry aspect, say that there is at least, maybe if you're not, a superhuman in different situations, maybe like anything else, if you're trying to get better at foul shooting, you shoot a bunch of foul shots. If you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to get yourself in a better mindset in those really, really difficult, tight, stressful situations of a game. The reason that I would say there's no such thing as clutch is because if you're already playing at the highest level, you've dealt with the highest amount of pressure. Just to get to Major League Baseball or the NBA or something like that, you have to have already dealt with pressure that normal people will never understand. But
Mm-hmm.
are there ways to work on that, to strengthen those muscles, so when there is a runner on third with 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth, you're able to take a deep breath and focus on the pitch that's coming and do the same thing that you did in the first inning?
There certainly are. I think there are ways to kind of build up that muscle, right? And I don't know, I guess whatever word you want to use for like clutch or however you phrase it, right? Some people use like a flow state. There's ways to kind of work on, ways to kind of get into the zone. So there's been a lot of studies that looked at athletes that when they, are really in a groove, have what a lot of people consider to be like momentum, that there's certain things like, maybe their resting heart rate or their metabolic rate that are maybe a little bit different than at other times. So if there's ways that we can almost like induce those states. So one of the big ones we look at is breath work, right? And this became popular, with pitchers, I think several years ago, looking at like diaphragmatic breathing and paced breathing and ways to kind of self-regulate your nervous system while you're on the mound to really help kind of decrease that fight or flight sensation. Because when you're feeling that fight or flight, what you're not able to do is really lock in and focus, right? Your body's almost in like survival mode. So we know that on a biological level, there probably is something to that emotional self-regulation that allows you to maybe quote unquote like block out the noise, right? And really kind of dial in. So I think those are skills. I think we can teach that. And there's also probably some people that maybe have some greater propensity, to kind of reach those states. Now, what is that? How do we predict that? That's where it gets a little fuzzy, but that there probably is something there.
Now, when something is coming up, like, for example, the Major League Baseball trade deadline
Mm-hmm.
or the off season, and us as fans, we get into this situation where we're like, man, we need a relief pitcher. We need somebody who can come in and get us a couple innings. So, this guy's on a team that's not competing. Let's throw a couple prospects, get him to come in and just expect the exact same production. But I think you've found, at least from what we've discussed today, that, fans don't think about the fact that, they're going to be going to a new apartment and they're going to have to get on a plane the 25 other guys they've been working with for the past however many months. Like, they're just going to say bye and then they're going to be dealing with a whole 25 different other dudes. And we might look at this as, oh, we grab piece A, asset A, and move it over to our team, and it becomes asset B over here. But you understand that that's not exactly how it goes, and a lot of those things might be really difficult for the player to adjust.
Absolutely. Yeah, these transitions can again be very stressful points, and I understand, right, the reaction as a fan. This is still an entertainment industry, and I think when you reach the professional level as an athlete, that's part of the business, right? You kind of sign up for that, understanding that, hey, this is a risk, that this could happen. It doesn't make it any easier necessarily, though, right? And it's also too, I think people don't understand too, like different teams have different, staff, support systems. You may have been working, with a specific trainer or, hitting coach or whatever like that, and all of a sudden things get uprooted. So I think it's part of the beauty of sport too, right? How kind of nuanced it is, and how it is so based on relationships and a team coming together. But there is the downside of that too, that those disruptions can oftentimes, derail a season or even derail a career to some extent.
Do you find that players tend to take those things personally? I know a big one that they talk about is arbitration in baseball,
Right.
and how a lot of agents don't want their players to know what's going on in arbitration, because you go into those meetings and the team just slams the player and talks about them like they're meaningless. And then eventually they're going to sign some sort of contract, and they're going to play for that team the next year after having heard all of those things. Are some of the ways that we just structure the business aspect of sports making it hard to deal with those kind of mental health issues?
Oh, without a doubt, right? That is part of the game. And I think, that's why it's important for athletes. We talk about like, who is your circle, right? Who do you have kind of protecting you? Who's defending you, right? Who's your agent? And how does that person affect your life, right? So, for some athletes, it's more of a big deal than others, right? Some athletes, actually enjoy that. They want to go in there and engage in the process and understand the contract side and the business side, and sometimes it actually serves as motivation, right, to go out there and to perform even better. But for other athletes, it's a total, like you said, distraction, and can derail things when they think the team doesn't support them, or, like you said, you just go in there and hear about how bad you are for however long, right? So I think it depends on the individual, but I think the best outcomes are usually when there's good support and when you align the player's personality with their level of involvement in any kind of process like that.
So, wanting to just, as we get ready to wrap up this conversation, bring it back to youth sports, because I do think that is where the people listening to this podcast will have the most influence. What are some ways that parents, youth coaches, up to high school coaches, what are some things that we can do on a daily basis to help the mental health of the young athletes in our lives?
Mm-hmm. It's one of the most important things we can do, right? And I would say culture starts from the bottom up. So this is, going into the home, like you said, with parents, kind of setting that example, modeling good behavior, both in the home and, during competition. So I think that's definitely one thing. Like I mentioned before, knowing where to turn and making those resources available. So, does your kid or does the athlete have someone that they know they can talk to, that would be confidential, private, and that sort of thing, right? We talked about the need for generalization as opposed to specialization, and exposing kids to not only different sports but different activities, different things in their life, making sure that there's time with friends, there's time with family, there's times that enrich our lives in other ways than just athletics. So I also think too, from an adult standpoint, they're probably is always helpful to have some level of reflection, right, and understanding, hey, where does my kid really stand competitively, and what do they need from me? Right? Does my kid need, like support, encouragement? Do they need to know that, hey, maybe it's okay if we don't, go to, try out for this team or do whatever they need to do? So I think, kind of a nuanced understanding, always from a supportive standpoint, and knowing where to look when things go poorly is probably a good place to start.
Actually, you made a really good point that I didn't even think of until you made it, which is to have those sort of realistic expectations, because we know the odds, no matter how good your kid is, there are a lot of people who have the same talent level as Mike Trout who are working other jobs right now, right? So it's not only the talent level, and having that realistic expectation. Maybe they're playing multiple sports, and basketball is just, your kid's maybe going to be 5'10". Like, that's not going to happen, right? It's probably not going to happen. So maybe you don't stress quite as much about basketball, and you use that more as that enjoyment, as that hobby, as that way to release stress. And maybe they're throwing 95. Having realistic expectations, I think, is a really good point to make, and probably something that comes a lot easier to parents who've been around the game a lot or been around sports a lot, because you can look at all 200 kids trying out for the basketball team and say, no, my kid's one of the best on this team. Or you can look at the baseball team and go, okay, so maybe baseball isn't my kid's thing. And having those expectations, I think, is a really, really big deal. So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Moley. This was a really great conversation, and something that I don't think gets addressed enough in fandom is the mental health aspect of the game. So I really appreciate all of your insight.
Thank you very much.
I'm your host, Rick Becker, and this has been episode 122 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.